You already know something has changed, not shifted, changed. There is a difference, and you recognize this. A shift implies return is possible. What has completed inside you does not permit return. That is the first thing I want to name before we go anywhere else. You have stopped being readable. That is not a metaphor. I am not speaking of mood or expression. I am speaking of something structural, something in the interior arrangement of you that once offered access, offered legibility, offered the particular quality of emotional transparency that others learned to rely on, perhaps to exploit, perhaps simply to take for granted as a feature of your presence. That quality is gone. It did not gradually fade. It completed. Most people, when they try to locate what has changed in you, will look in the wrong direction entirely. They will study your words, your tone, your willingness or unwillingness to engage. They will look for anger, for coldness, for the kind of visible withdrawal that can be named in an argument and therefore negotiated. They will not find what they are looking for, because what has changed in you is not on the surface. It never was. The surface, in fact, remains almost entirely intact. You are still civil, you are still present, you may even still be kind, but the key is no longer on the table. I want you to hold that image not as decoration, but as fact. There was a key. It sat for years in a visible place. Others reached for it freely. Some did not even notice they were reaching. They simply expected it to be there, the way one expects a door to open when one turns the handle. The key is gone now, not hidden, not locked away in protest, simply no longer offered. That is the second thing I want you to understand. Before we go any further, you did not remove the key as an act of punishment. You removed it because you finally understood it was never yours to give in the first place. That understanding, quiet, complete, entirely without drama, is what most people will miss. And it is one of the two clues I intend to trace with you today. I have spent the better part of my life in the company of people who had completed exactly this kind of interior movement without knowing what had happened to them. They came to me confused, sometimes frightened, by their own stillness. They described it in various ways. One woman said it felt like she had gone deaf to a particular frequency. She could still hear everything else, but a whole register of sound had simply dropped out of her perception. A man, a physician, described it as the sensation of having closed a hand around something and then realizing the hand was now just closed, not holding anything, not reaching for anything, simply a hand in its resting position. Neither of these people had made a decision. That is what I want you to notice. Neither of them had chosen withdrawal the way one chooses an action. The withdrawal had chosen them. It had completed in them the way a biological process completes, not dramatically, not in a single moment. You could point to afterward and say, there, that was when it happened. It happened the way bone hardens, imperceptibly, structurally. Finally, in my work on the development of personality, I observed again and again that the people who reached genuine individuation did not arrive there through heroic effort or deliberate practice. They arrived there because the psyche, left long enough under sufficient pressure, eventually reorganizes itself around a new center. The old center, what I would call the adapted self, the persona-saturated self, that lived in relation to others' expectations becomes untenable. Not philosophically untenable, structurally untenable. It begins to cost more energy to maintain than the organism possesses. And then, without announcement, without ceremony, it releases. What you feel afterward is not liberation, not in the way that word is typically used. It is not warm. It does not feel like expansion. It feels, if anything, like contraction, a precise, cool contraction around what is genuinely yours, as opposed to what you have been carrying for others. I want to stay with this for a moment, because the contraction is the first clue. Most people who have observed you through this period, friends, family, perhaps a partner, perhaps a colleague you were once closely attuned to, they have noticed something. They cannot name it accurately, but they have noticed it. They notice that a door they used to be able to walk through is now simply not a door anymore. It is a wall, a perfectly polished, perfectly cordial wall, and they do not know what they did. That last part is important. In most cases, they did not do any single thing. There was no catastrophic betrayal, no particular incident you could point to. What happened was slower, more cumulative, and far more damning than any single offense. What happened is that they repeatedly accessed something in you that you did not know you had the right to withhold. And at some point, not a point you chose, a point the psyche chose for you, the access ended. I have called this the collapse of emotional readability. Though it is not precisely a collapse, it is more accurate to say it is a withdrawal of the self from its own legible surface. The persona, and here I use the word in the strict technical sense I gave it in my earlier work, the persona is that layer of self that mediates between inner life and social function. It is necessary, it is not false, but it is also not the whole of you. The difficulty is that for people of a particular psychological type, and you will know whether this describes you, the persona becomes unusually permeable. The boundary between what you feel and what others can sense in you becomes thin to the point of transparency. You are, in effect, readable, legible, open in a way that others come to depend on. They come to depend on it not because they are malicious, though some may be, but because readable people are extraordinarily useful. They can be tracked, they can be calibrated. You always know where you stand with them, not because they tell you, but because their interior state is available to you without permission. You simply reach in and check what completes in a person like you. What I am calling the first clue is the end of that permeability. The skin thickens, not as armor, not as defense, as skin, as what skin is supposed to be, a boundary that is alive, that breathes, that can feel, but that does not allow indiscriminate passage. The people around you will experience this as a kind of loss. They will grieve it, often without knowing what they are grieving. They will try various tactics to restore what they had. They will escalate emotional intensity, become warmer, more affectionate, more demanding, more accusatory, trying to find the frequency that once produced your response. They will find that none of these frequencies work anymore, not because you have decided to punish them, but because the receiver has been changed. The tuning is different. They are broadcasting to a station that no longer exists. This is not cruelty. I want to be precise about that. because you may have been told that it is. You may have been told that your withdrawal is a form of emotional violence, a withholding, a passive aggression. I want to name that interpretation plainly for what it is, a misreading that serves the reader's access needs, not the truth of what has occurred inside you. Let me tell you about a dream. Not your dream, a dream reported to me by a man I worked with for several years, a man in his middle 40s who had spent the first half of his adult life in a marriage that required him to function as the emotional regulator for everyone around him. He dreamed that he was standing in a large building, a hotel, or perhaps a hospital. The architecture kept shifting, and he was holding a ring of keys. The keys were worn smooth, clearly old, clearly used thousands of times. People kept approaching him, one after another, and asking for the key to their room, and he kept giving them. He knew which key went to which door without being told. He had always known. He distributed the keys without effort, without thought, and for a long time in the dream this felt correct, efficient, even satisfying. Then he noticed his hand was empty. He looked down and the ring of keys was gone. He had given them all away. And now people were still approaching him. The line had not shortened at all and reaching toward his hand. And his hand was empty, and he stood there with his empty hand extended, understanding something he could not put into words inside the dream. He was not distressed. That was the part that stayed with him when he woke. He had expected, on waking, to feel the distress appropriate to such a situation. No keys, people waiting, a failure of function, but he felt instead something he could only describe as accurate. The empty hand felt accurate. I want to hold the worn key here. You will recognize it now as something specific, not merely symbolic. The wear on the key tells you everything. It has been used so many times that its individual cuts, the specific pattern that makes it a key to a particular lock, have been smoothed down. In my work on the archetypes, I have observed that the instruments of psychological service, the tools by which a person maintains access and connection with others when used beyond their intended frequency, begin to lose their specificity. They become general purpose. They open any door. They belong to everyone. A key that belongs to everyone belongs to no one. The first clue that reveals itself when you look clearly is this: the person you are dealing with has reclaimed specificity. They have stopped being universally available. The key has been recalled, and if you could observe them closely enough, not their words, not their explanations, but the micro quality of their attention, you would notice that the attention itself has changed. It is no longer scanning for what you need. It is no longer pre-organized around your comfort. It is present, certainly, but it is present in a different way. It is present the way a stone is present, complete, unorganized around your requirement. Most people, encountering this quality of presence for the first time in someone they previously found warm and responsive, will experience it as coldness. They will say, and they will mean this sincerely, that the person has become cold. But what they are naming as coldness is, in precise psychological terms, simply the absence of their own reflection in another person's attention. They were never seeing warmth. They were seeing themselves. When the mirror is no longer offered, the room appears to go dark. That is not darkness. That is the room's actual light. The second clue is quieter. I will come to it in time, but I want first to let the first clue settle into its full weight, because it is typically the one that is most catastrophically misread. When a person reaches this completion, when readability withdraws and the key is recalled, the people around them will make a predictable interpretive error. They will locate the cause in an event. They will search backward through the recent history of the relationship for the precipitating incident. The wound they inflicted, the mistake they made, they are looking for something they can address, can apologize for, can repair. They are looking, in other words, for a narrative that keeps them inside the story, because if there is a cause they produced, there is also a remedy they can produce. The more perceptive among them will search for a long time. They will not find what they are looking for, because what completed inside you was not caused by them in that direct, addressable sense. They may have been the circumstance within which it completed. They may have been, in some cases, the pressure that finally exceeded the load-bearing capacity of the old structure. But they were not the cause. The cause was interior. The cause was years of the psyche living in a configuration that was not true, not false in the sense of dishonest, but untrue in the architectural sense, a building erected on insufficient foundation, maintained through extraordinary effort, serving functions it was never designed to serve. What completed was a correction, a structural correction, and structural corrections, in my experience, do not reverse. They are not decisions. You cannot uncomplete what the psyche has completed. The unread letter I want to bring in the second symbol here, because it belongs at this moment in the telling. There is in the experience of someone who has reached this completion a particular quality of relationship to all the communications that are now being sent their way. The letters that arrive, the calls, the messages, the escalating attempts at contact and explanation and re-entry, they are not ignored in the common sense of that word. They are received, they are understood. They simply remain, in an important psychological sense, unread, not because you have decided not to read them, but because the part of you that once organized itself around others' need to be heard has restructured. The inbox still receives. The decoding mechanism has changed, and what once produced in you an immediate mobilization, a sense of urgency, of obligation, of guilt, of the need to respond and repair, now produces something much quieter. Observation, simply that, an observation. The way one observes weather. You recognize this. You have felt this shift in yourself and perhaps been frightened by it, not because it felt wrong, but because it felt so precisely right. And the precision of it suggested an irreversibility you were not entirely ready to accept. You are ready now. That is why you are here. That is why I am speaking. The irreversibility is not what most people think it is. When I say that what has completed inside you does not reverse, I am not speaking of stubbornness. I am not describing a decision held firm against pressure. I am describing something closer to what happens when water, long held at a particular temperature, finally crosses the threshold into a different state. The water does not decide to become ice. The water does not resist becoming water again out of pride or unresolved anger. It is simply no longer water in that sense. The conditions that produced the previous state are no longer present, and without those conditions, the previous state is not available. This is what the people around you cannot accept. Not, will not, cannot, because accepting it would require them to relinquish something that has organized their relationship to you for years, possibly for the entirety of their knowledge of you. What they must relinquish is the model, the interior model they carry of who you are, what you respond to, what you need, what moves you, what can be used to reach you. That model is now inaccurate, and an inaccurate model of a person is not a minor inconvenience. It is, psychologically speaking, a kind of death, not your death, the death of the version of you they were in relationship with, the version that was readable, the version whose interior landscape they knew how to navigate. That version has completed, and they are now standing in front of someone they do not. In the most fundamental sense, no, some will name this as betrayal. I want you to be prepared for that. The accusation of betrayal is one of the most predictable responses to completed withdrawal, and it is worth examining with some care, because it carries a particular psychological payload that can, if you are not precise about it, reactivate the old guilt structure. The logic of the accusation runs like this: you were one way, and now you are another way, and the change was not negotiated, was not announced, was not presented for discussion or consent. You changed without permission, and changing without permission, so the argument goes, is a form of abandonment. I have heard this argument in various forms throughout my years of clinical practice, and I want to name what it actually contains. Beneath the moral framing, the accusation of betrayal in this context is not, at its core, a moral claim. It is an access claim. What is being named as betrayal is, in precise terms, the revocation of access that was previously granted, or rather, that was previously taken, without either party fully recognizing the transaction for what it was. When you were readable, when the key was on the table, when your interior life was available to be checked and calibrated and used as an emotional resource that was a form of access, it felt to both of you, perhaps, like intimacy. In some cases, it genuinely was intimacy. In the early period, before the asymmetry calcified. But at some point, and this is the moment that neither party typically marks at the time, the access stopped being mutual and became directional. They could read you, you could not read them. Or rather, you could read them, but what you read was not received in kind. Your readability fed the relationship. Their opacity was simply accepted, perhaps even idealized, as depth, as mystery, as the particular quality that made them compelling. The asymmetry ran in one direction for long enough that it became structural. It became the architecture of the relationship. And you, being the readable one, being the one whose interior was always already available, you organized your inner life around the function this served, not consciously, not through deliberate self-abnegation, simply through the long habit of availability. The way a path in a field is created not by decision but by repeated walking. What I observed again and again in my patients, those who had reached this kind of completion, is that the readability was never simply a personality trait. It had a history. It was learned in an earlier context, usually a much earlier context in which being readable, being available, being emotionally legible to another person was not simply convenient but necessary, in which the ability to be accurately sensed and found by another was a condition of safety, sometimes a condition of love, sometimes a condition of survival in the most literal sense available to a child in an uncertain emotional environment. The readable adult is almost always the child who learned that being known was the closest approximation to being safe. I want to let that sit because it is not something I say quickly. In my work on the development of personality, I traced the ways in which early psychological configurations, those adaptations made in the first years of life, before the ego has the resources to evaluate what it is doing, persist as structural features of the adult psyche. They do not persist as memories in the ordinary sense. They persist as orientations, as the baseline assumption about what a relationship requires and what I must offer in order to remain within it. The readable person carries, usually below the level of conscious awareness, the assumption that their interior life is the price of admission, that being fully sensed, fully available, fully open to another person's access is what love requires, what connection requires, what not being alone requires. This assumption was formed in a context where it was, perhaps, accurate or at least functional. In the original environment, the family, the early attachment, it may have been the correct read of the conditions, and the psyche of the child, being as brilliant and adaptive as it is, encoded that read and made it automatic, made it structural, so that decades later, in entirely different conditions, with entirely different people, the same orientation persists, the interior is offered. The key is placed on the table, not as a conscious choice, as an assumption so deep it does not surface as a choice at all. It surfaces simply as what you do, as what you are, until it doesn't. The second clue, I told you I would return to it. I am returning to it now because it cannot be understood fully without first understanding the history I have just described. The second clue requires a different kind of attention than the first. The first clue, the withdrawal of readability, the recall of the key, is something that can, if you are paying close attention, be observed from outside. You can sense it in the quality of someone's attention. You can feel in the presence of someone who has completed this movement that something has changed. The first clue is available, in principle, to a perceptive observer. The second clue is interior. It cannot be observed from outside. It can only be inferred, and even then, only by someone who has already been paying a particular kind of attention, not to the surface of the relationship, but to what was never there. The second clue is the end of preemptive guilt. I want to be exact about what I mean by this, because guilt, in the ordinary sense, is well understood, and what I am describing is more specific than the ordinary usage. Preemptive guilt is the guilt that operates before the transgression. It is guilt organized not around something you have done, but around something you might do, might fail to do, might withhold, might refuse. It is guilt that shapes behavior in advance of the event that causes the readable person to give before being asked, to apologize before causing offense, to smooth the surface of the relationship before any friction has appeared. It is anticipatory, structural, and almost entirely invisible to the person who carries it, because it never presents itself as guilt. It presents itself as consideration, as care, as attentiveness to others' needs. This is one of the subtler observations I want to make today, because it is the one most likely to be misunderstood, or worse, weaponized. The person who organized their behavior around preemptive guilt does not experience themselves as guilty. They experience themselves as thoughtful, as emotionally intelligent, as someone who knows how to navigate relationships with care, and in a formal sense, they are not wrong. The behavior is careful, the attention is real, but the motivation, the engine beneath the behavior is not care in the autonomous sense. It is the management of a threat. The threat is this: if I do not provide, if I do not give, if I do not make myself available and readable and emotionally responsive, I will be experienced as absent, as cold, as having failed, and being experienced as absent, as cold, as having failed. That is not an abstract social discomfort for a person who learned early that their emotional availability was the price of not being alone. That is a reactivation of something much older, much more dangerous. Preemptive guilt is, in its deepest structure, fear wearing the clothing of virtue. When this structure completes, when the withdrawal happens and the key is recalled, one of the first things to go is the preemptive guilt. And this is often more disorienting to the person experiencing the completion than the withdrawal itself. Because the guilt was always there, it was the background frequency of the emotional life, so constant and so familiar that its presence was not noticed as a presence. Only its absence is noticed, and the absence is initially experienced as wrongness, as something having gone missing that should be there. They were short with me and I felt nothing. I should have felt guilty. I didn't. What is wrong with me? Nothing is wrong with you. What has completed inside you has removed the apparatus by which someone else's disappointment was automatically converted into your obligation. The conversion mechanism is gone. Their disappointment now lands on you and you feel it. You register it. You understand it, but it stops there. It does not travel further. It does not reorganize your interior around the task of repairing their state. This is not indifference. Indifference is the absence of perception. What you have now is full perception with what I would call structural non-transmission. You can see the weather perfectly clearly. You are no longer required to become the weather. That distinction between perceiving and becoming is the one that most psychological accounts of empathy miss entirely. The assumption, almost universal in popular psychology, is that empathy means taking the other person's emotional state into yourself, feeling what they feel, absorbing, and for a person of your psychological type, that assumption was not merely accepted but lived enacted, reflexively, thousands of times. Their distress became your distress. Their disappointment became your shame. Their need became your emergency. The end of preemptive guilt does not mean the end of empathy. It means empathy has found its actual boundary, the boundary that was always supposed to be there but wasn't, not because you failed to create it, but because the early psychological formation never gave you the template for it. You could see, you could feel, you could understand completely what another person was experiencing. You simply had no internal mechanism for stopping there, for saying, with the body's full authority, I see this, and it is yours, and it does not pass through me into me. That mechanism has now been built, not chosen, built by the psyche itself in the long process that culminated in what I called, at the start, a completed interior event. I want to bring in the second dream now. It came from a woman I worked with, a woman who had spent years in what she described as a transparent life, visible to everyone, available to everyone, never quite real to herself. She dreamed that she was standing in a room full of clocks, all running, all showing different times. A figure stood in the center of the room with its back to her. She knew the figure was someone she had been close to, not a specific person from her waking life. Or rather, the figure held the quality of everyone she had ever organized herself around. The figure did not turn. She understood, in the dream, that the figure would not turn, and she stood there, waiting for the distress that should have arrived, the urgency, the need to do something, to make the figure turn, to restore contact. The distress did not arrive. What arrived instead was an awareness of the clocks, all running, all different, all correct, each in its own reference frame. She woke and wrote in her notebook, the clocks were not broken. They were just not synchronized to him anymore. I have thought about that image many times. The clocks all running, the figure not turning. The expected distress replaced by a kind of temporal awareness, an awareness of one's own time, running at one's own rate, no longer synchronized to another person's rhythm. Synchronization is one of the most under-examined features of close psychological entanglement. When two people are in a deeply asymmetric relationship, one readable, one opaque, one organized around the other's need, one simply expecting the organization, their psychic rhythms become entrained. The readable person's nervous system begins to run on the other person's schedule. Their emotional states initialize around the other person's states. Their attention goes first, automatically and without choice, to the other person's interior. They wake thinking about the other. They fall asleep processing the other. Their own rhythms have been, in the most precise sense, colonized. The completion of withdrawal is also a completion of desynchronization. The clocks stop running in relation to the other person. They begin, and this is the part that is disorienting, that feels like loss even when it is recovery. They begin running at their own pace, and one's own pace, after years of synchronization to another, feels at first like silence, like absence, like a room from which sound has been withdrawn. That is not silence. That is your own frequency, heard for perhaps the first time without competition. Your own frequency is not what you expected. This is one of the things no one tells you about completion. Everyone who has ever written or spoken about psychological liberation, and I use that word with full awareness of its limitations, has described the aftermath in terms of expansion, of opening, of the sensation of coming into a larger space, and there is something true in that description. I will not entirely dismiss it, but it is incomplete. It skips past something that deserves its own account, its own careful attention, because before the expansion, if it comes, and it does not always come quickly, there is a period of unfamiliarity with the self that can be more disorienting than anything that preceded it. You have spent years, perhaps decades, experiencing your own interior primarily in relation to others. Your feelings were organized around others' states, your attention initialized around others' needs. Your emotional life was, in the deepest sense, relational before it was personal. And now, in the aftermath of completion, you are asked not by anyone, by circumstance, by the simple fact of the change, you are asked to experience your own interior without that organizing structure. What do I feel when what I feel is not in response to anyone? The question itself reveals the depth of the formation, that it is a question at all, that there is genuine uncertainty about what one's own interior contains when no relational demand is present. This is the indicator of how long the readable configuration has been in place. The person who has always known their own feelings without needing a relational context to activate them will find this question strange. For you, it is not strange, it is simply accurate. In my work on the structure and dynamics of the psyche, I describe the process by which the unconscious compensates for what the conscious attitude suppresses or ignores. The compensation is not punitive, it is regulatory. The psyche is always attempting to maintain something like equilibrium, not the false equilibrium of suppression, where one part of the self holds another part in sustained arrest, but the genuine equilibrium of wholeness, where all of what you are is available to the totality of your functioning. For the readable person, for the person who organized their life around availability and preemptive guilt and the management of others' emotional states, the suppressed material, the compensatory unconscious has been carrying, is almost always the same. It is anger, not the hot, surface anger of the moment, not the reactive anger that occasionally broke through in the earlier years and was then immediately suppressed, apologized for, explained away. The anger I am speaking of is older and quieter and far more significant. It is the anger of a person who was never permitted by circumstance, by formation, by the logic of their own survival, to have a self that was not organized around others. It is the anger of years of giving keys to doors that were not yours. I have observed this material in enough people, in enough detail, to speak of it with some confidence. The anger is not what it appears to be when it first surfaces. When it first surfaces, and it does surface, in the process I am describing, it must surface. It comes wearing the face of resentment, of grievance, of a specific bitterness directed at specific people who took specific things, and there is truth in that face. The grievances are often real. The specific people did take specific things. That is not a distortion, but the anger itself is not primarily about those people. The anger is about the configuration, about the years lived in a form that was not true, about the self that was not available to itself because it was always already allocated elsewhere. This is the anger that the integration of completion requires you to meet, not to express in the direction of the people who occasioned it, though expression may sometimes be appropriate. And I will speak to that, but to recognize as yours, as part of you, as the shadow material that the adapted, readably, guilt-organized self could not afford to acknowledge, because acknowledging it would have threatened the entire structure on which the relationships depended. The readable person cannot be angry. Anger is opaque. Anger is unavailable. Anger says there is something here that is mine and I am not giving it to you. A person organized around availability cannot sustain that position. The anger goes underground. It has to, and underground it accumulates, and accumulating, it eventually becomes what drives the psyche's demand for correction. The withdrawal you have experienced, what I called at the opening a completed interior event. It was not primarily driven by exhaustion, though exhaustion was present. It was not primarily driven by a decision to protect yourself, though protection is one of its effects. It was driven at the deepest level by the accumulated weight of the underground anger finally reaching a threshold beyond which the psyche could not continue the suppression without fracturing something essential. The withdrawal was the anger expressing itself in the only form the psychological structure could permit, not as confrontation, not as accusation, simply as absence, as the quiet, finale, structurally complete removal of what had always been given. I want to be careful here, because this is the place where the understanding most easily goes wrong. When I say the withdrawal was driven by accumulated anger, I am not saying the withdrawal was an expression of that anger in the sense of being a weapon deployed against specific people. That is the interpretation the people around you will make. And they will be wrong. They will experience your withdrawal as a punishment, as a statement, as a message directed at them. They will experience it as I am doing this to you. And they will respond to it as they would respond to an aggression with counter-aggression, or with escalating attempts at appeasement, or with the particular cruelty of pathologizing your withdrawal as a symptom of your damage. None of these responses will be accurate. All of them will be recognizable. The withdrawal was not directed at them. The withdrawal was directed, in the most precise sense, toward you, toward the reclamation of a self that had been living in a configuration that was costing more than it was worth, more than it was true, more than the organism could continue to sustain without significant interior damage. The people around you were not targets. They were, in the most honest account, simply no longer sufficient reason to continue the suppression. That is a harder truth than anger. Anger implies they still matter enough to hurt. What I am describing is closer to the quiet truth that the ledger has simply been closed. Not in bitterness, not in revenge. The ledger is closed because the transaction it was tracking has ended, and there is nothing left to record. The closed hand, I brought it in at the beginning, the image the physician described of a hand that had been holding something and was now simply closed, resting, not holding, not reaching. I want to return to it here because it carries something important about the integration of anger that I have not yet said directly. The closed hand is not a fist. This distinction is the one most people miss, because they are accustomed to thinking about reclaimed selfhood as a form of assertion, as a statement of force, as the posture of someone who has finally decided to fight for themselves. And there is a certain cultural narrative, one I have always found psychologically shallow, that describes the emergence from excessive accommodation in exactly those terms. The person who was too giving has finally learned to be strong, to stand their ground, to fight back. The closed hand I am describing is not that. The closed hand is simply a hand that is no longer open, not clenched in preparation for impact, not raised in threat or declaration, simply closed, in its resting state, the natural resting state of a hand that is not in the act of giving. What this means, in psychological terms, is that the integration of the anger does not require its expression outward. In fact, the demand for expression, the idea that you must confront, must say all the things you held back, must give the people around you the accounting they are owed. This demand is itself a residue of the old configuration. It is the old structure asking to remain relevant, to remain in contact, to keep the relational transaction alive even in the form of conflict. True integration is quieter. The anger is recognized as yours. It is held, it is understood as the signal it was always trying to send, the signal that a self was present here, had always been present here, was not being honored, and then it is incorporated, not discharged, incorporated, made part of the structure that now constitutes the boundary. This is what I mean when I say that boundaries, for a person who has completed this movement, are not rules, they are not decisions, they are not policies one applies consistently in difficult situations. They are structure, they are what you are now made of. In the way that healed bone is denser at the fracture site than the surrounding material. The integration of the anger, the shadow material, the underground accumulation does not leave you softer, it leaves you more precisely yourself, which from the outside, to people accustomed to the permeable version of you, will read as hard. You are not hard, you are specific. I want to trace now what happens to the roles. Every relationship, over time, develops a role structure, not the formal roles of family or institution, but the subtler, mostly unspoken roles that organize the emotional economy of two people together. Who regulates, who soothes, who pursues, who withdraws, who names the difficulty and who waits for it to be named, who carries the guilt and who carries the authority. These roles are not chosen, they emerge from the interaction of two people's psychological structures, each finding the grooves worn by the other's history. In the configuration I have been describing, the readable person and their counterpart, the role structure is typically quite fixed. The readable person regulates, soothes, pursues, names, and carries the guilt. The counterpart is available to be regulated, to receive the soothing, to be pursued, to have their difficulty named for them, and to exercise, often without awareness, a kind of emotional authority conferred by their opacity. This role structure becomes self-reinforcing over time. Each person's behavior confirms and deepens the other's role. The readable person's pursuit confirms the counterpart's authority. The counterpart's opacity confirms the readable person's obligation to fill the silence with attunement, with effort, with interpretation. The whole system runs on this mutual confirmation, and it runs smoothly at a cost that is paid almost entirely by one side. When the completion happens, when the readable person withdraws, when the key is recalled and the preemptive guilt dissolves, the role structure loses its foundation. And a role structure without its foundation does not simply adjust, it collapses. The collapse of a role structure is not a minor relational adjustment. It is a crisis genuinely, structurally, a crisis for the person whose psychological organization depended on the roles remaining stable, and that person, facing the crisis of the collapsed structure, will do what people do in a crisis of this kind. They will attempt to restore the previous state by any means available. This is the period you may be in now, or may be moving toward, the period in which the people whose roles have collapsed are attempting, with increasing urgency and increasingly varied strategies, to reactivate the old configuration, to find the input that produces the old output, to restore your readability. And here is what I want to name with some precision. The strategies they will use will not be primarily hostile. Some will be hostile, yes, but most will be the opposite. Most will be the strategies of connection, of intimacy, of appeal. They will offer you things understanding, vulnerability, acknowledgement of past failures, promises of change. They will become, suddenly and remarkably, the very version of themselves you once needed them to be. They will produce, with what appears to be genuine effort, exactly the qualities whose absence helped drive the completion. This is not cynicism on my part. Some of it will be genuine. The crisis of losing a readable, available, guilt-organized partner or friend or family member can produce genuine reflection. Genuine change is not impossible. But I want you to hold one thing clearly, without drama and without cruelty. Genuine change in another person is not evidence that the completion inside you should reverse. What completed in you completed because of the configuration's total cost to your interior life, not because of any single behavior that can be corrected. A person can become more considerate, more present, more willing to acknowledge your interior, and you can recognize that change, honor it even, and still be precisely who you have become. The completion is not a punishment that is lifted when the sentence is served. The unread letter accumulates now. I want you to notice that the communications arrive and they are more frequent, more effortful, more emotionally sophisticated than anything that came before, and they sit in a pile that you observe but do not open in the old sense. You read the words, you understand the content, but the reading does not produce in you the activation it was designed to produce. The urgency is absent. The guilt is absent. The reorganization of your interior around their need absent. What is present instead is something I can only describe as a kind of curious neutrality. Not coldness, I have already distinguished these. Not indifference, something closer to the quality of attention one brings to weather one is watching from indoors. Full perception, no obligation. The letter is understood. It does not pass through. And here, in this precise moment, the moment of understanding without transmission, of receiving without reorganizing, here is where the second clue becomes visible to anyone paying close enough attention. The second clue is not something you do, it is something you no longer do, and the absence of it is legible. If you know what to look for in the quality of every interaction, the person who has completed this movement no longer performs their own interiority for others. They no longer offer their emotional states as evidence of their investment, their care, their presence in the relationship. They no longer make visible, through expression and responsiveness and the particular warmth of the readily moved, the fact of their engagement. They are engaged, they are present, but the engagement no longer announces itself. And this quiet, structurally complete, entirely undramatic withdrawal of performed interiority. This is what most people will miss entirely, because they are looking for something they can argue with, something they can name as a behavior and address as a behavior. The withdrawal of performed interiority is not a behavior, it is a state, it is who you are now. In the same structural sense, that the hardened fracture site is what the bone is now. The people who miss this clue will continue trying to reach you through the channels that no longer exist. They will send letters to an address that has closed. They will use keys on doors that are now walls. They will interpret your continued civility, your continued presence, your continued capacity for ordinary connection, as evidence that the old access is still available, just temporarily suspended, just requiring the right approach, just waiting for sufficient effort or sufficient love or sufficient change. They are wrong, and you know it, and you recognize this. The knowing is not cruel, the knowing is simply accurate. Accuracy is not a comfortable thing to live inside. I want to say that plainly, because the cultural pressure on a person who has reached this completion, the pressure from outside, and more dangerously, the residual pressure from the old formation still operating inside is enormous. The pressure insists that accuracy of this kind is a form of hardness that requires justification, that knowing someone cannot reach you anymore, and remaining in that knowing without moving to correct it, without softening it with hope or qualification, or the offer of a pathway back, that this stillness is a moral failure, a failure of generosity, a failure of love. I have watched this pressure operate in patient after patient. It is perhaps the most tenacious residue of the old configuration. The body of the habit survives the completion of the shift. The guilt mechanism is structurally offline. As I described, preemptive guilt has ended, but the accusation of its absence can still land, can still produce a secondary guilt, the guilt of not feeling guilty, the guilt of the closed hand, the guilt of a person who has, finally and structurally, stopped performing their own availability. You will be told, in various forms and with various degrees of sophistication, that what you have become is less warm, less present, less loving, less human. Sometimes, in the particular register of that accusation, and you will need to know, not as a defense, not as a position, you argue, but as a fact, you carry that what you have become is not less. It is more precisely bounded, more accurately located, more genuinely present, in the sense that the presence you now offer is not organized around management of another person's state. It is simply your presence, unperformed, unallocated in advance, available on its own terms. That kind of presence is rarer than the performed kind. It is also, to people who have learned to rely on the performed kind, deeply uncomfortable, because it cannot be managed, it cannot be predicted, it does not respond to the usual inputs. It is present when it is present and absent when it is absent. And the absence means nothing beyond the fact of absence. There is no signal to decode. There is no emotional subtext to analyze for evidence of your care or its withdrawal. You simply are what you are. When you are it, I want to speak now about the shadow. Not abstractly, I have already introduced it in the material around anger, but in its specific shape in this configuration. At this stage of the process, because the shadow, in the aftermath of completion, changes. The material changes. What was underground is no longer underground in the same sense, and what was suppressed, the anger, the self-possession, the capacity for opacity having been integrated, leaves behind a vacancy, and vacancies in the psyche, as I have observed throughout my life's work, do not remain empty. What moves into the vacancy left by the integrated anger is something I want to name carefully, because it is easily misidentified. It is grief. Not the grief of loss in the ordinary sense, not the grief of mourning a relationship that has ended, or a person who has gone, or a future that will not now arrive. Those griefs are real, and I do not dismiss them. But the grief I am speaking of is older than any of those specific objects. It is the grief of the self for the years lived in the configuration that was not true. It is the grief of a person who was, for a very long time, not available to themselves, and who is only now, in the aftermath of completion, beginning to encounter the scope of that unavailability. The grief is proportional to the length of the formation, and because the formation was typically installed early in childhood, in the first relationships that taught the psyche what safety required, the grief is very old. It is the grief of decades, sometimes the grief of a whole life lived from a position that was never entirely one's own. This grief will arrive. If it has not already arrived, it will, and when it does, I want you to recognize it for what it is, not as evidence that the completion was wrong, not as the psyche's way of asking you to return to the old configuration, not as a signal that you have made a mistake. The grief is the accurate response to an accurate accounting. It is the emotional register of the truth finally being received that something was lost long ago, before you had the resources to prevent it, and that the life organized around the compensation for that loss is now also behind you. You are grieving two losses simultaneously: the self you were, the adapted, readably, guilt-organized self, and the self you did not get to be during the years of that configuration. Both losses are real. The grief honors both. There is a particular quality of solitude that becomes available after completion, and I want to describe it with some care because it is unlike the solitude that preceded it. The solitude that the readable person experiences before completion to the solitude they feel in the midst of their relationships. In the middle of their most populated life is the solitude of fundamental non-recognition. They are known in the sense of being legible, being available, being accurately tracked and calibrated by the people around them. But they are not recognized. There is a distinction here that matters enormously. To be known is to be readable. To be recognized is to be met. The readable person is known by everyone and recognized by almost no one, because recognition requires the recognizer to be present as themselves, not as a receiver of your emotional service, not as a beneficiary of your preemptive attunement, but as a genuine other who encounters you as a genuine self. The configuration does not permit this. The dynamic does not create the conditions for it. And so the readable person lives in a paradox, surrounded by people who know them intimately and utterly alone in the sense that matters. The solitude after completion is different. It is the solitude of a person who is no longer organized around being found, who no longer requires, at the structural level, the validation of being accurately sensed by another. The old solitude was shaped like a lack, shaped like the absence of the recognition it was always seeking. This new solitude is shaped like itself. It is not organized around anything it does not contain. It is simply what it is. When no demand is being made of it, it is possible to inhabit this solitude without suffering And that possibility, the mere possibility of it, is something the pre-completion self could not have believed. The pre-completion self required others' presence, or at least the possibility of others' presence, in order to feel located, in order to feel real. The self that exists after completion has a different source of location. It is located by its own interiority, by the anger that has been integrated, by the grief that is being moved through, by the simple, structural, unperformed fact of its own existence. You exist without being witnessed. That sentence, I know, will land differently depending on where you are in the process. If the completion is recent, it may land as loss. If you have been in the completion for some time, it may land as relief. Either response is accurate. Both can be true simultaneously. I want to return, near the end of this account, to the two clues named in the title of what we have been building together, because I have traced them at length and I want now to draw them into their final, precise shape. The first clue is the withdrawal of readability, the end of permeability, the recall of the key. It is visible. If you know how to look in the quality of someone's attention, the attention that is present, fully functioning, perceptive, but no longer organized around your comfort. It is visible in the closed hand, not aggressive, not punitive, simply no longer extended in the default position of offering. When you encounter a person whose attention has this quality, warm in some technical sense, recognizably engaged, but somehow behind glass, you are in the presence of someone who has completed a fundamental interior reorganization. The glass is not a defense mechanism. It is a new permeability level. It is what the boundary looks like when it has been built from the inside. The second clue is the end of preemptive guilt, and it is subtler because it shows up as an absence rather than a presence. It shows up in the conversations that do not produce the expected outcome. You say something that previously would have activated the other person's reorganization around your need, and the reorganization does not happen. They hear you, they understand you, they may even acknowledge you, but the interior rearrangement, the automatic reorientation of their attention and energy toward managing your state, it does not occur. The machinery is not running. You are speaking into a space that receives your words and does not convert them into obligation. Most people, encountering this, will escalate. They will increase the emotional intensity of the communication, on the assumption that the mechanism is present but requires more input to activate. They will be wrong. The mechanism is not present. No quantity of input will activate what no longer exists. These two clues together, the withdrawal of readability and the end of preemptive guilt, are the signature of a completed psychological reorganization. They appear together because they have the same origin. They were installed together in the early formation as a single complex of adaptation, and they complete together when the psyche finally accumulates sufficient pressure to demand its own reconfiguration. When you see them together, when you encounter a person who is present but not readable, engaged but no longer convertible, civil but closed to emotional colonization, you are not in the presence of damage. You are not in the presence of someone who has been hardened by trauma into a diminished version of their earlier warmth. You are in the presence of someone who has completed. There is one more thing I want to address before I bring this account to its close, and it is the question of return. The question of whether what has completed can be reopened, whether the key can be replaced on the table, whether readability can be restored, whether the relationships that were organized around the old configuration can reconstitute themselves on different terms. I want to answer this honestly, without comfort and without unnecessary severity. Return is not impossible, but it is rarer than most people hope, and the form it takes is almost never the form they are imagining. What they are imagining, the people reaching toward you, sending the unread letters, searching for the input that will restore the old output. What they are imagining is a restoration, a return to the previous state, perhaps improved, perhaps with the problematic elements corrected, but fundamentally the same configuration at a higher quality. They want the readable person back, only now recognized and honored and no longer depleted. What is possible is something different. What is possible is a new configuration, genuinely new, built on the terms of the person who has completed, not the terms of the old dynamic. A relationship in which your readability is not assumed, not accessed without permission, not treated as the default emotional infrastructure of the connection. A relationship in which your availability is genuinely mutual, in which the other person's interior is as available to you as yours is to them, and in which neither person is pre-organized around the other's need. This kind of relationship requires the other person to change in ways that are more fundamental than behavior. It requires them to relinquish the access they had, to tolerate the glass, to encounter you as the specific, bounded, no longer universally available person you have become, and to find that person genuinely worth knowing, not as a project of restoration, but as a new reality. Some people will be capable of this, most will not because they are deficient, but because the work required is genuine and the incentive from their side is low. They were well served by the old configuration. The new configuration serves them less. The people who will choose to remain in genuine relationship with you after completion are the people for whom your specific, bounded, post-completion self is more interesting than the readable, available, pre-completion version. They are rare. They are worth knowing who they are. The symbols I have carried through this account, the worn key, the unread letter, the closed hand, I want to let them rest now without further interpretation. They have done their work. They have carried what I needed them to carry. They are yours now, to encounter in your own dreams, your own memory, your own slow processing of what has been named here. If they return to you in the night, and some of them will, in forms you will not immediately recognize as related to what we have traced today, receive them as the psyche's own continued working of this material. Do not interpret them immediately. Let them remain image before they become meaning. The figure in the room of clocks did not turn. The clocks ran at their own rates. The dreamer stood and observed and felt the expected distress not arrive, and in its place something accurate. I have tried across the length of this account to be accurate with you, not kind, in the usual sense, not reassuring, not helpful in the way that leaves you with a task, a practice, a method for improving your situation. There is no improvement to be made. There is only the recognition of what has already completed, the naming of it in terms precise enough that the naming itself becomes a form of acknowledgement that the psyche requires. The psyche does not require validation. It does not require approval. It requires, at certain junctures in its development, only to be seen accurately, to have what it has done acknowledged in the register of truth rather than the register of comfort. What you have done, what has completed inside you, through you, in the long, slow structural process I have been describing is this. You have stopped being available to being used as a surface on which others find their own reflection. The mirror has been retired. What stands in its place is a person. That sentence is the whole of what I have been saying. The person who stood where the mirror was is not new. They were always there, present beneath the adaptation, waiting with the patience that has no alternative but to wait, carrying the anger and the grief and the specific, irreducible, unmirrored shape of a self that belonged to no one's need. They are here now, not arrived. That word implies a journey completed and a destination reached, and a settling into the comfortable permanence of having become. It is not that. It is more simply and more completely that the suppression has ended, and what was always there is now simply present, unannounced, undramatic, standing in the room where the mirror used to be, with the clocks running at their own rates, with a closed hand that is not a fist, reading the letters that arrive and understanding them completely and feeling them stop precisely at the skin. The psychological event that has completed inside you is the permanent structural end of the self organized around being found.